So I was basically saying we were going to start maybe just having a little chat about the writing of the songs
Yeah,
because
definitely.
I mean, this is weird. It's kind of like we're interviewing each other and it feels a bit contrived, but actually we've never really had these kind of conversations between each other before. It's kind of like when we talk about stuff, it's usually pretty practical, and it's like, oh, why don't you move this drum hit here, or why don't you play this bass note here, rather than what was going through your
Yeah,
mind at the time when you laid this down. So
yeah, true. Or I'll just like send you an idea without much context, and you'll just give me feedback, or vice versa.
exactly, yeah. And
Yeah,
I guess we kind of like it that way because it's just like, well, I'm not going to explain it. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't. But
yeah, definitely.
I have to say, when you first sent me these songs, I was like, oh, this is different, and
Yeah,
it's quite different from the other stuff, like specifically Elderflower, which is kind of the previous album we were working on together,
yeah,
like a lot more together when we were both in London, right? And then you did what? You ended up moving to Scotland, right?
yeah. Actually, I started these songs like just on the cusp of moving. So I think I started them in London and then finished them in Scotland. Um, but yeah, at that point, I think we had sort of released Elderflower. You were like a little bit burnt out,
Yeah.
and I just somehow I can't remember quite how it happened, but I just started writing in like on my own, and then it sort of just developed into all of these songs and all this material.
It's kind of weird
Um,
because, like from my perspective, you wrote quite a lot, pretty
yeah,
intensely. Like I don't think I've ever written that much that intensely, or you have maybe since. So, like, why was it so? Like, what was going on? Why was it so? Why were you so prolific in that period?
I don't know, man. It's very hard to explain, but I just feel like I had this burst of inspiration, and I think part of it was related to like what was going on in my personal life. You know, I'd had some like was going through some stuff. I'd like sort of come out of the other end of having some like mental health struggles, and I was having some anxiety. And
Yeah,
then when all of that kind of lifted, and I started feeling better and feeling more like myself again, I just suddenly had this like rush of inspiration, and it just seemed like every time I sat down to work on music, things were just flowing. You know, whereas normally, you know, you'd have those days where you spend a whole day trying to write, and you know, you get to the end of the day, and
yeah,
you
man.
know,
I
you're
mean,
like,
that
oh,
sounds that
this
sounds
is all
amazing.
rubbish.
That sounds
And
amazing to me.
for some reason, every time I sat down, I was just like, it was just easy. It was just kind of effortless almost. And so yeah, I just kind of smashed out like a lot of songs in a pretty short period of time.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Because
Yeah,
yeah, I have to say for me, when I've been writing, it's always a struggle. It always feels like it's a struggle for me.
yeah,
And it did when we were writing Elderflower as well. It was very much a struggle. But I think one thing that's quite interesting is that the change that took place in terms of the music of like Monument to Her Exile era versus Elderflower era was very much kind of synchronized with like changes in our own personal lives or our own like whatever mental health or outlooks on life, which is quite interesting because yeah, I mean, I don't know why it happened. Maybe it was the music. Maybe it was Elderflower itself that was responsible for our outlooks on life, and we just needed to write something different to change that outlook. But
yeah. I mean, who knows what comes first, right? I
yeah,
reckon there's interactions going on there.
yeah,
Um, but you're right. Like I think we both were. It was quite like a transitional period for both of us in different ways,
yeah,
and that
100%.
probably is reflected in the music.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, because like I mean, tonally, were you like keen on? Were you going for a particular tone when you were writing the instrumentals? Or did it just start that way and you pursued it and you went down that hole, or were you just like, I'm going to write whatever and it's going to come out however it does?
yeah, I think it was a bit of both. I mean, I kind of knew that I wanted to write stuff that was different to Elderflower. You know, less like brooding, a bit less heavy. I wanted
Yeah,
it to feel more like introspective, to have a bit more space and feel like have like a sort of lightness to it, and then
yeah,
sort of like create more atmosphere. And I was playing around with like a lot of like guitar delay and a lot of reverbs, and bringing in a lot more other instruments like the synths and the xylos. And
Yeah.
so it was partly conscious, but I also just kind of let it happen. I think the only one sort of like rule or restriction that I placed on myself very consciously was that I really wanted to try writing without using any like heavy guitars, without relying on like distortion,
Yeah.
or at least like using it very very minimally.
Yeah.
And that was kind of a challenge, of like how do I create something that sounds like us, it sounds like Defy the Ocean,
Yeah.
without relying on that tool, because it's just like something that you revert to so much when you want to.
But is that something that was in your
yeah.
mind? Were you like, oh, we have to sound like Defy the Ocean, or were you just like, whatever, whatever?
I think to some extent I was like, I want this to still be
You
us.
wrote it with the intention of it being released by us, so you wanted it to have some DNA.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess I feel like we'll never stray too far from our thing. It's like
I don't know. I think there's a massive difference, right? Especially in terms of like one of the things that I think that we've always tried to do is introduce a lot of dynamics into our songs, right? So there's powerful sections, there's kind of quiet sections, there's and it's all kind of about the journey between those things, right? Between those kind of emotions.
Absolutely,
and if you look at like the stuff that you've been writing on the Monument to Her Exile stuff, I mean, I'm talking because I know and I've heard like the instrumentals at least for all of the 10 tracks or whatever, right? But people listening here will have only probably heard 2. And if they're among a very select group of people, will have heard 4 or 5. So I know kind of what's coming. I know that there's a huge amount of dynamics in the stuff that you've written, but like you said, it doesn't rely on the kind of heavy guitars to bring those dynamics as much. That to me is the difference. I mean, if you look at something like most of the Elderflower EP or album, whatever you want to call it, because it kind of sits in between lengthwise, was written. I think one song was written by me, one song was written by you, and then the rest was kind of a mix, right? And the song that was written by you was the title track, Elderflower, right? And that track is like super dynamic, right? It's super quiet, then super loud, then super quiet, then super loud, then even louder, right? That's kind of the structure of the song, which is fine. It works. And it's very kind of, it borrowed a lot from kind of grunge and alt metal of the early noughties to a certain extent, that kind of structure going from quiet to super heavy and then quiet to super heavy, like you could hear in a Deftones song or something like that. But like what you were sending me after for the more recent stuff, I was like, okay, well this is not that. This is not a kind of simplistic approach to building dynamics. This isn't A and B, right? This is just a lot more subtle. And I guess maybe with subtlety comes some difficulty. Maybe in terms of like listeners even. Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a challenge for sure. I mean, that my songwriting has always been a bit unconventional. Like I'm not very good at the whole A-B structure.
Well, it's funny you should mention that actually, because I was going through the projects, well, the one project for chapter 1 today, and I was decided to mark up all the different sections of the track so that I could easily see what the song structure was. And so the first track, Sub Solar, I'm doing it. I've got it up here. I've got intro, verse 1, bridge, verse 2, bridge 2, pre-chorus, chorus 1, middle A, middle B, verse 3, bridge 3, pre-chorus 2, chorus 2, climax. Right? Pretty standard, pretty standard stuff. To be fair, it's just pretty standard. And then I got to Subluna, the second song, and I'm going intro, verse 1, bridge 1, verse 2, bridge 2, middle, climax. There's no chorus in that song. And I remember when
Yeah,
you sent me that song, I was like, dude, I need a chorus, man.
yeah, it's all
I
over the
need
place.
something.
Well, actually, that's really interesting because obviously these two songs, Subsolar and Subluna, they were written as, part one and part two of like one song, essentially,
Exactly,
right?
yeah.
And, we can talk about this a bit more, but like one of the things, another thing that I wanted to do with this music, with these new songs was play around with like reorchestration of themes and melodies, right? And I guess part of that comes from like growing up and listening to a lot of prog albums, a lot of concept albums where that's like a common tool.
Yeah.
And I've always been a big fan of it. And that's kind of happening a lot here. So, for example, the entire verse of Subluna Part
Is the
Two
chorus.
is the chorus of Part One. Just
It's funny, every time
yeah.
so I was, because recently I decided to pick up the guitar and start playing through some of the parts again. And I must have realized this at the time when I was recording the guitars, but I must have forgotten it because I sat down and I was like, oh shit, it's exactly the same. It's
Yeah.
literally exactly the
Well,
same chords, yeah.
I guess I take that as a compliment because I feel like it's not obvious that it's the same because there's so many things about it that are different. Like it's in a different tempo, it's in a different time signature,
Yeah, it's
it's
one's
arpeggiated
arpeggiated rather than with the chords, yeah.
rather than with chords. But yeah, I mean, I think there was some part of me that after I wrote Subsolar and then I decided, okay, there's going to be a part two. I was sort of just taking some liberties and I was like, okay, part two is going to be a bit more crazy, a bit more experimental, a bit more rhythmically all over the place.
Yeah.
And I think I just kind of, let that experimental side loose a little bit.
Yeah.
And I thought that would be interesting, like sort of having part one and part two with that contrast.
I really like part two. I think it's, out of the two tracks, it's my favorite just because it's experimental and it goes off in weird places. And
Yeah, it's definitely my favorite as well.
in terms of the writing as well, like vocals,
mm,
it just, yeah, something about the drum and bass kind of style verse stuff was really freeing, like to be able to do some kind of a bit more faster delivery of vocals, which I hadn't really been doing until then. It was like,
yeah,
it was really it was quite liberating, I think, from my perspective. But
interesting.
then you get to that, the what I call the dark middle section, which is, I can't remember what time signatures you were using in that section, to be honest. I can bring them up
It's
actually.
I think it's kind of all over the place, man. Even I don't remember, but that is probably my
Well,
favorite section of the whole two songs.
you don't remember because you sent me a project file which had no time signatures programmed in, and I had to go in and work them out and program them in afterwards. So
That is true.
I can tell you what they are. So from bar 184, or maybe I gave up at this point. I think maybe I gave up at this point. I think
Yeah, you
it's,
probably just like programmed in like a bunch of 16th notes and just
yeah, it's just all, it's all
let
down
it
as,
happen.
it's all down as 8/8. But
Yeah,
I think you've got like a 7/8 and a 9/8 and then a 6/8. Basically, it just kind of goes through that.
probably.
That sounds. There's a lot of eights in the whole track, but I think I might have just, yeah, I might have
Yeah,
put
and
eights there for the
verse
metronome.
is in the verse is in 7/8, I think, right? It's just it's kind of chaos, but
It's in 7/8. Yeah, I mean I've put it here as 14/8, but it's the same thing.
I think that section is my favorite section though of the whole two songs because
The dark middle.
the dark middle, yeah, because it's kind of like the most ambitious thing I've written, I think, in the sense that if you listen to every instrument, it's kind of madness. Like the guitar is there's this like completely discordant chord in there. The bass is kind of really busy. The drums, the rhythm is all over the place. The time signatures.
Yeah, let's listen to the drum. Let's listen to the drums actually.
Somehow it just all came together for me, and I absolutely love what you did with the vocals, and I love the lyrics in that section.
That was
Yeah.
actually one of the hardest bit to write vocals for, actually, because it was just, I had no idea. It's like, how this is the challenge. This is the challenge that you present to me, right? So I'm just
Yeah.
going to swap over to the project view. This is the challenge you present to me often. It's you give me some weird shit, and it's like, how do I de-weird this shit with the vocals? How do I give the user, talking like it's my job. How do I give the listener something to latch onto, so that they're not kind of lost? And I think one of the like, this section is cool, but it's let me just close this music here. It definitely toys with that line of, this is getting a bit fucking weird, a bit fucked up, right?
Yeah,
which is
absolutely.
Which is fine, because I quite enjoy that about it. But
yeah, it's definitely not for the average listener.
Yeah, and I always try and say, well, if this section's doing this, then does it match with the theme of the lyrics or the tone of the lyrics? So if there's this kind of swirling kind of section, then do I want a lyric that is kind of thematically the same, like I'm lost or blah blah, whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
Let's listen to the drums in that section. I'm just gonna play the drums, solo them. Yeah, so it does a weird, it starts off weird and then it goes into 4/4, right?
Yeah, there is some regularity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you got the pulse of the ride throughout, which is quite good.
That's kind of the only thing that holds it together, is that that ride is sort of almost playing this like quarter note pulse. Yeah. And it's also backed up by I think we had like a tambourine or something that was like backing that up. That's right. For me, the only thing that holds the whole section together, because
you're right.
Nothing else. There's like nothing else to latch onto other than that. But
there is some percussion here, actually. Yeah, there's just some tambourine going on. Yeah.
It just really grounds the whole thing for me.
Yeah, I think without that quarter note, but it's actually it's a very slow pulse, actually, isn't it? It's just super, super slow.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of one of the things I like about it, is that there's almost a laid backness to it because the pulse is so slow, but underneath there's so many notes going on. It's so busy, and it's almost like a contradiction. And I really enjoy like creating those sorts of contrasts.
I think the other thing that you did is you put a fucking weird as hell bass line over the top of it.
Oh my god!
It's actually like, it took me a long time to get my head around it, because I was just like, how? I couldn't work out where it began and where it ended, and just the cycle of it.
It's definitely strange.
So I'll play it now so people can hear it, because it ended up being like one of my favorite bass lines. But even now, like, I'm trying to hum along to it and I'm just like, oh no, I missed a beat, It's crazy.
Yeah.
So in the first part, it's quite regular. So this is normal, but I think when you get into the second part of the middle section, it goes pretty crazy. Here.
Yeah, it's coming.
You bastard. And something about where it repeats. Does it repeat? I feel like when the cycle ends, you're cutting a beat short on the drums. Is that right, or something?
It kind of never resolves on the one. It sort of comes back in on the upbeat.
Right.
And it's just it's very unforgiving. It's
very unforgiving. As a listener or as a player, or as both, probably.
Both actually. That section was surprisingly hard to play on the drums, because
you've got nothing to ground yourself to, right? You're just kind of having to drive the whole thing. You've got nothing to latch onto.
True, and there were ghost notes going on continuously underneath, and I remember getting those really even took a couple of takes.
Yeah, I'm sure. We can actually listen to some of we can listen to just the drums and listen to some of the ghost notes, which I can like pop the volume up on the ghost notes to hear. Yeah, it's certainly not regular. Certainly pretty crazy. But yeah, and then the guitars on top of that section are really nice as well. I really dig the guitars in that section.
Yeah, it's definitely my favorite guitar bit of the whole chapter.
One of my favorite guitar bits is actually in chapter 2, which you know about.
Oh yeah.
You know the one I'm talking about. So
I think I do.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you bring the bass in. It's going off in 3 different directions, right?
Pretty much.
And then it's like, hey Chris, you want to put some vocals on top of this?
Yeah, but you nailed it, man. That's the thing. You always nail it. I know that I can throw anything at you and you'll find a way.
It's not a competition, man. You shouldn't be trying to. It's like, let me see how we can screw this guy up this time.
It's really interesting though, because like one of the challenges is that when I'm writing, I kind of have no vision for what the vocals are going to do. So I'm not even thinking about like, and this is often a kind of fault of mine. Something I need to work on is that I'm not thinking about, oh, let me leave some space for the vocals to do their thing. Yeah. I'm often like trying to get it to a point where it sounds really good to me, even as an instrumental track.
Yeah.
And often that means that I'm going overboard and I'm putting too many notes in.
I think
I'm not leaving enough space.
Generally I would, when I used to write, I used to do exactly the same thing. I used to just be like, this has got to sound good as an instrumental, basically.
Yeah.
The only thing that really changes potentially for me between an instrumental is you've probably got some lead guitar, you've probably got some melody over the top in the instrumental that maybe would clash or would limit the options of the vocal. And then the other thing is, and I often come back to you with this, is to say you need a few more repetitions here because I've got no room to really say anything, right? And definitely. Often I'll say, put another 4 bars or put another 8 bars in this section and like that. Especially like when you're coming out of the first chorus and you're going into whatever section we've coined the verse at that point, and there's only like 4 bars or 8 bars, and I'm like, I need a bit of a second verse to kind of get back into things. But generally, like, it hasn't been too much of an issue, I think, with what you've sent me. But there have been instances where I can't remember, but I think I've just stripped out an entire guitar melody. I think that might actually be in chapter 2, in one of the tracks in chapter 2. I think I took out one whole guitar melody, and
yeah, it's happened a couple of times where we just said, this isn't right. Like,
less is more.
Yeah, less is more, and leave room for a vocal melody. And it just comes down to me wanting to hear some kind of melody and wanting it to sound good as an instrumental, and then when it comes time to you doing your thing, realizing, okay, we don't actually need another melody. Let's get rid of that one.
What can you tell me? Like, because before I like jump into like individual tracks and stuff like that, and we're going to start with the drums. What can you tell me about the drumming on chapter 1? Like, was there a kind of philosophy? Was there something that you said, I'm not going to do this, or I'm going to do this in the tracks? Like, what were you trying to achieve with the final drums, with the composition of the drums?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think my approach to writing drum parts is always the same, where I just kind of want to not kind of overplay, not make them too busy. I just kind of want to serve the song, really. but at the same time putting in like a couple of little subtle things that, if you're a musician and you're listening, or you're someone that appreciates those types of subtleties, you'll be able to pick it out and
Yeah.
be like, oh yeah, that was like a really nice little lick there or something.
Yeah, nice little offbeat, or whatever,
Yeah, but I guess I like playing subtle parts. Obviously, I think the big kind of, I guess, busiest drum part in this whole thing is in the second track, is in Subluna, both in terms of the verse, that kind of like almost drum and bassy, jungly beat.
Yeah.
That's again was quite tricky to play. And then obviously the outro, which is kind of the only bit of the whole chapter where it's really about the drums, or at least they're a big focal point, because you've just got this kind of wall of sound, and the drums are just doing all this crazy.
I think we should
almost like a bit of a drum solo, whilst.
Yeah, it's kind of it's the outro particularly is like it's like a relaxed drum solo. It's like, this is the end of the set, guys, and I'm just going off on one a bit, it's kind of got that vibe to it. Yeah. It's quite natural.
It probably doesn't sound like it, but I actually sat and planned out like every note that I was going to play. And yeah, I just kind of, I don't really know if I have a process for doing that, but I just almost sometimes feel like I'd like to hear an emphasis here, or I'd like to hear that kind of feel there. And
it's one of those things, isn't it?
It just kind of comes naturally usually.
It's one of those things, and I think I do the same with vocals actually, is just like when I'm playing over the part, when I'm singing over the part, you just find stuff that latches on, and you're just like, oh, that's a really cool melody. Or you, in your case, oh, that's I want to hit on the and here. I want to hit that tom on the and here, because that's like, that's where it feels really good. And you just kind of iterate upon that until you built something up, and then, basically you've written the whole thing note for note. I think that's kind of the best way. Let's play this outro, because I think it's a really good. I'll play the drums. Maybe chuck the bass in as well. There's a lot of ghost notes in this as well. A lot of ghost notes.
Mm-hmm.
And the downbeat is pretty all over the place, right?
Pretty much.
Well, no, there is a pretty actually, the first half of it, the downbeat is less prominent, and then as you get into the second half, the downbeat becomes more prominent, right?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to give some sort of
resolve,
a little glimpse of
groove.
And where it sort of feels like, it's grounding, for a bar, and then it kind of goes off again, playing with that tension.
Yeah.
I really like how that came out, and I guess that's the most the bit where the drums are really featured the most, I suppose, on the whole thing.
Yeah. Cool. So I don't know. Maybe I should go into, hey, Parsnip, how you doing, man? Maybe I should. We've got a Defy fan in the watching at the moment. So welcome, Defy fan, whoever you may be. So I think maybe what I should do is just start breaking down some of these tracks and just talking about what I was doing with the drums, because for me, actually, this was the first time that I received or worked with this number of like drum tracks before. And one of the things that you did is you went to your friend's studio in Cyprus and you recorded the drums on an awesome console.
Recorded at Soundscape Studios in Cyprus by Chris Karanambilis.
Yep. And from what I remember, big fan, bro. Good to hear. And from what I remember, and from what I can see, there was something like 20 microphones used to mic up the kit. You had
Yeah, it was something crazy like that.
Yeah, so you had snare top and bottom mics. You had four tom top and bottom mics. So already you're talking about 10 mics just on the snare and the toms. You had
Yeah,
kick
maybe
in,
even
kick out.
3 on there. I don't know.
Um,
A couple of room mics.
there
Couple
were
of overheads.
Yeah, so we've got couple of overheads. Obviously, we've got 3 room mics, so a left, a right, and a mono compressed. Actually, I don't know if the mono compressed was made from the left and the right. I'm not sure. And then we've got I've actually deleted a number of tracks from the project which I didn't end up using, but some spot mics and some like big room mics that were recorded as well. I didn't end up using them in this, so I kind of regret it a bit. And on chapter 2, I did end up using the bigger room mics a bit more. But I think when I was producing this, I had a very clear idea of what I wanted, right? And it was I wanted 2 completely contradictory things to be true for these 2 songs. I wanted them to be both super clear and super clean, but also atmospheric at the same time. So I immediately, before I even started doing anything, I made it difficult for myself, because like, how do you make like drums super clean, super clear, and then also provide atmosphere in the song?
Yeah.
So what I decided to do was like, okay, well, I'm going to keep the drums pretty dry for the most part, and just feel really natural. Like, I wanted you to feel like you're in the room, but I didn't want to like go overboard. I wanted the kicks and the snares to be reasonably punchy, but not like metal punchy where it's just this thing smacking you in the face because of the subtlety of the songs, right? So that's kind of where I landed on that. And then I was like, well, I'm gonna bring in that atmosphere with the other instruments and the vocals and the backing vocals. And actually, the main vocals, for the most part, are reasonably dry, although there's quite a bit of processing. But I feel like the atmosphere was built in a kind of iterative way. Nothing alone is like really reverby or anything like that. Excuse me. Now, I don't know how. I think maybe what's worth talking about is just some of the sample replacement that I did, because, like it or not, I decided I wanted this really clean drum sound, and in order to achieve that, I wanted to augment the kick and the snare with sampled hits, so that things like bleed. So like in the snare track, for example, if we listen to just the snare track that I was working with, the snare top, you'll hear there can be quite a bit of spill of let's turn the bass off as well. So there's a lot of hi-hat in that snare, and obviously, like, it's one of the things that you don't want. You want to keep the hi-hat as clean as possible. Another thing I really like is when you hear the hi-hat being played in the song, is you like to hear it not kind of located down the center channel, kind of like to hear it where it's being played. And I think both me and Marcus like drums that are oriented in terms of I'm the player, right? Which means hi-hat on the left, toms going from high to low, left to right. So that's kind of the perspective of the drums. Marcus, I can hear your keyboard. So that's kind of that was kind of the approach. But the problem is the snare is always down the center channel, right? So if you have, so we've got a separate hi-hat mic and we've got a separate snare mic. Hey, Marcel, thanks for the follow, much appreciated. So you got the hi-hat on the left, your mic. So here I've got this, you can see here I've got this pan to 64% left, so it's pretty heavily left. But if you're getting a lot of spill of the hi-hat on the snare mic, which is sat in the center, it kind of drags the stereo image of the hi-hat to the center. So what I wanted to end up being able to do is to rely a bit less on the snare mic for a lot of the snare so that I could have that much wider placement of the hi-hat. So in order to do that, there's a few tricks that I've gone about, right? So one is you process the snare mic pretty simply, right? The second is you duplicate the snare, and you call this, and this is a trick that is not my own. It's borrowed from a producer and musician called Kurt Ballou of a band called Converge, and he owns God City Studios in Massachusetts, and he does a lot of heavy like punk and grind music. But he's got, his drum processing is just so great. It's just so great. And I watched this excellent tutorial from him, and it shows what he does, right? So what he does is he duplicates the snare track, and he creates this track called Snare Turbo. And he also does the same for the kick. He creates a kick turbo, where the turbo version of that track is just much more heavily compressed, and whatever additional processing you want on it. So in this case, I've got just a kind of a console. So let me swap between the two. So I'll play and I'll swap between the snare top and the snare turbo, and you'll hear the difference in what the processing is doing. So that's the snare. Let's find a section that doesn't have cross sticks and actually has proper snares in them. Okay, so you can hear the snare here. And then when we swap over to the snare turbo, now you're not hearing much hi-hat there. It's because I'm gating the snare. So I'm doing some really aggressive gating, which you wouldn't be able to do if you were only relying on a single snare track. And then I'm also using this, it's called Bark of Dog, and it's basically like a harmonic exciter, and it's doing that around 212 hertz, which is kind of like to give a bit more body to the snare. And you kind of blend those two to create something a bit more than the original. So together they, which I can't do. And you can hear that body of the snare coming through. And then on top of that, we've also got some snare samples that are blended in at various volumes. So this one is, what is this one? This is on a Ludwig snare. So you can hear, this is, if you can hear this, it's quite a low, got quite low frequencies to this snare. So I was using it for that kind of bottom end. And then this one is a Black Beauty. So you can hear this one. This one's got a lot more crack to it, right? A lot more high end. So I was like marrying these two, one with the low end, one with the high end that I want. That's going to create a great sound. And then finally, we've got this Ludwig Clear. And this has got a lot more woody sound to it. So I wanted the low end, I wanted the woodiness, and I wanted the crack. And I wanted to mix all those together, blend them in with the original snare. That way, I've got a nice, like, rounded snare sound that is, that means I'm not actually having to rely a huge amount on that snare mic with a lot of hi-hat spill in it, and I can get that hi-hat separation that I'm after. So if you listen to all the snare stuff together, you end up with something that's got some crack, it's got some body, it's got some wood in it, right? But it's not actually like miles away from the original snare. And that's kind of, snare replacement, kick replacement. Yeah, it was something I was very keen not to do at the beginning, and I wanted to keep everything natural and just as untouched as possible. But then it soon became clear that because of just because of the songs, just because of the way they were, like when Marcus wrote them, he was writing them by programming the drums, And it was kind of, when you do that, and when you take into account the fact that you have this super clean programmed drum source and you're building a song around it, when you kind of take that away and you put something in a bit looser, a bit more organic, it doesn't necessarily work. And that's kind of what we were finding here. It seemed to work better when the drums were like super clear and super and just super clean. So exactly what I did with the snare there, I did with the kicks. So we have the kick here. Let's go to a slightly busier kick section. So it's a nice beefy low-end kick sound that we've got. And I wanted to enhance that with the kick turbo. So same thing again. You can see by doing that, what I've done here is I've gated it as well. The kick generally doesn't need as much gating, nowhere near as much gating as a snare, because you don't have a lot of, like, where the mic is positioned down by the feet, there's usually not a lot of ancillary noise, right? So we've got the gate, then we've got a little bit of EQing. So what I decided to do here with the EQing was actually reduce a lot of the low end, not rely on it so much. And then I've got it going into a compressor heavily. So if I'm trying to remember what I was doing, I didn't want the low end of the signal source triggering the compressor so much, which is why I took the low end out before it goes into the compressor, right? So here you can see that it's compressing quite heavily-ish, between 2 and 5 dB, right? And together, like, this one's got a bit more snap and this one's got a bit more beef. And together they sound really punchy. Let me know if the volume's okay on the output here, because I can probably bring it up a touch. I think I will. I'll bring it up a touch, especially when we're listening to some of the individual tracks, which are kind of quieter outside the context of the track. So let's try that again. That should be better. What's the point of gating the drums, stopping any bleed? It's a good question. What door is this? This is Cakewalk, so it's a free door now, so highly recommended. I guess the door that it's closest to is Cubase. I'm actually looking to move to Cubase pretty soon, but it's just one of those things. I've been using this for years. The projects that Marcus has sent me were in Cakewalk as well, so it just made sense to use the same one for as much efficiency as possible. The volume is very quiet. Okay, I've turned it up a little bit. Let me know if that's better. How's that? Can you hear those kicks? What's the point of gating the drums, stopping any bleed? So the point of gating the drums is basically what you're doing is you're saying, I only want to hear stuff from this source when it goes above a certain level. Anything else I don't want to hear. So that means any kind of quiet stuff that's going on in between the hits is removed. Now, you've got to find a balance, because if you gate everything, you're going to end up with like a really stoppy, unnatural sound, which is why 2 dB more. Okay, let me go to the console here and see if I can do that for you. Let me see. Maybe that will do it. How's that? So yeah, you don't want this really stoppy sound. You want something that's a lot more natural, which is kind of why I'm blending a gated source with a non-gated source. And that gated source I'm generally abusing. Like, so it's heavily gated, it's got some stupid EQ on it, and it's got a lot of compression on it. And then I did exactly the same thing with the kicks. I found a couple of samples that I thought really complemented the original. So I've got, so these samples came from Superior Drummer 2. So we've got this Iote Custom. You can hear this is mainly thud, this sample. And then this one's all click. This one's all in the upper frequencies, right? So together you end up with something nice and beefy and rounded. You're still getting that bleed, so still like what you would call a natural kick sound or kick mic sound, but it's still nicely processed. So that's generally what I've done with those elements there. Might be worth talking about the hi-hat, because one of the things I did with the hi-hat, and you can see there's quite a bit of automation on here, volume automation and also some automation of the EQ. So I like, and Marcus likes generally a bit of quite a loud hi-hat, but it can get quite overbearing, particularly in sections where you're just hitting an open hi-hat. It's just so tiring to the ear. So kind of what you want to do is you want to cut out some of that low end of the hi-hat, which I may have done here. So what do I have here? Yeah, I've cut back like 10 dB of 200 hertz with a shelf, and then boosted a little bit of 360, and then boosted a little bit of around 7 kilohertz, and then taken out a little bit around 2.3 kilohertz, which will probably, my decision for that is probably just to get out of the way of some of the other mid to high range instruments, maybe even the vocals at that range. But then I wanted to excite the hi-hat, and this is something I've been doing for quite a while. So previously I'd done this with I believe it's a Voxengo plugin called Harmon EQ, which you can kind of push an EQ up in a certain frequency range and it kind of adds some harmonic excitement. In this case, I've used this plugin called Vertigo VSM3, which is basically a distortion plugin, but it's like a mastering grade distortion plugin. And you can get very granular about the types of harmonic distortion that you create. And the idea was just to excite the hi-hat a little bit. So basically bring its presence up in the mix without having to push the fader up so much, right? So you're aware of it more, but without having to push the volume up. So this is what the hi-hat sounds like. So you can hear here it's being smashed, right? If we take out the EQ, you hear it's a lot more aggressive. Now in the context of the drumming, so if you listen to the whole kit without that EQ applied, it's going to be quite fatiguing, I think. It's probably the right way to say it. You apply that and it just takes some of the edge off. And then finally, yeah, just this slight distortion, which is probably very subtle. Don't know if you can catch it on stream, but something I like to do. So that's without, and that's with. Can actually boost it a little bit more. You can hear it there, but we keep it pretty low. It's just a bit of harmonic excitement. What else to talk about? I guess the overheads were really, really lovely, beautifully recorded overheads. The sound of just the overheads alone, really nice. And we can see what we did with those overheads here. So I processed them a fair amount, actually. Some people are pretty funny about touching overheads too much, but I did do a few things. So let me see. I can't remember if I did actually use any compression on the overheads. So I didn't. I've got some EQ going. Oh no, there's no EQ going on here. I don't know what this is doing. I think I ended up turning this off. I think all that I'm doing here is doing a little bit of high pass filter around 80 hertz. And then the main EQ here. So just bringing out some of the 650 hertz area. So this is a mag EQ4, which is a really nice EQ. Small changes make a big difference. So I wanted to take a lot of the body out of the overheads and then add a little bit of air to them. So I've got mainly cuts here. So let's see if I can bypass it. So this is without. And this is with. Really cleans it up, like very audibly different. And you might think, oh well, yeah, it sounded better without. Yeah, maybe, but in the context of all the other drum mics and everything, are the overheads doing what I want them to do? And in this case, they were probably encroaching a little bit too much on the direct mics and just kind of making things messier than they needed to be. So then finally, this is an awesome plugin. I use this so much. This is called TDR Nova and it's free. There is a paid version which gives you a little bit of extra control, but even this free version, I use the shit out of it. It's a dynamic EQ. So what this means is that I'm actually compressing various parts of the frequency spectrum by the amount that I want. So in this case, what I probably ended up doing is, you can see here I've got a little cut here around 1.5 kilohertz. I was probably thinking, shit, this is getting a bit difficult to listen to, a bit fatiguing on the ear, especially in this area here where there's a lot of vocal activity. So I basically introduced a cut here. And this basically allows you to say, I want to create some compression here if the audio goes beyond a certain volume in this frequency. And so if I play, there may be some parts where, here you go. So you can see how this is reacting, right? So this one around 1.5K is getting triggered quite a lot with the snare. And this shelf up here is getting triggered quite a lot with the hi-hats, right? And that's another way I've managed to manage the hi-hats and the kind of overbearing sound of that open hi-hat is just using a bit of dynamic EQ. So as soon as that kicks in, hi Duke and Idaho, nice to have you on the stream, buddy. So yeah, just using a bit of dynamic EQ there can really just tame the hi-hats. And then basically when there's nothing else going on during the track that encroaches on those frequencies or passes a certain threshold of those frequencies, the EQ is doing nothing. So it's a really nice way to put kind of frequency safeguards in place. So you'll see that I also use it on the bass a lot. So sometimes, you know, when you're playing the bass, you might get a note that's a bit scratchy or something like that. It can really peak, especially if you're applying like a lot of high end later down the chain to try and bring out like some presence in the bass guitar, for example. If you've got a peak earlier in the chain somewhere, I'll answer your question in a second. If you've got a peak earlier on in the chain somewhere, and then you're bringing in this extra EQ later to increase the presence, that peak is going to really bother you. It's going to stick out like a sore thumb. What is the interest compared to a regular EQ? So it works in a completely different way. It's basically, I think the best way to think about it is like it's a compressor with EQ level controls. So what I'm doing here is I'm not, while I am cutting, because you can see this yellow line, this yellowy gold line, while I am cutting about 1.5 dB at 1.5 kilohertz, what I've also done is I've introduced a threshold here. So you can see, select 3, I've introduced a threshold. And that threshold basically allows me to control how much I reduce the volume at that frequency based on the input. So for this threshold, basically I've set the threshold at minus 19 dB. I've got a 2:1 compression ratio. So that basically means that for every 2 decibels that I go above the threshold, I reduce by half. And I can also set attack and release times for that specific threshold, for that specific frequency. And I can do that in up to 4 separate bands. And the paid version of this plugin, I think, gives you 6 or maybe unlimited bands. But even with the free version, I can do like side chaining. So an example of where I've used this is on the room mics. How do I choose the attack and release? It depends on what I'm trying to achieve. So in this case, I was probably aware that I wanted to tame the snare a little bit. And with regards to the overheads, I was probably wanting to keep some of the initial transient of the snare because I want this kind of clean sound. Is it dynamic? Yeah, it's completely dynamic. So basically, they're called dynamic EQs. So just to go back to Dukan's question, in this case, I wanted to keep as much of the transient as possible. So I chose attack and release times based on that. So I only come in after 5 milliseconds. So it leaves a tiny bit of crack for the initial transient. And then the release is reasonably slow. But one way I've used this, which is quite interesting. So what happens is when you bring in samples, a lot of samples, you run the risk of, cheers for the follow, Dukan. When you bring in a lot of samples into your drums, you run the risk of like upsetting the balance and of the drum track as a whole, and making it feel a little less natural, because you've got these overheads, you've got your snare and mic, snare and kick mics, or toms if you're sample replacing those. But that signal, those samples are not being fed into any kind of reverb, so they're kind of absent, completely absent from the overheads and any room mics. So what you have to do after, in order to kind of create this natural feel, is introduce some reverb along the way and feed those sample signals into the reverb, and then balance it with your existing room and overheads, right? So the way that I was talking about Kurt Ballou earlier, who I borrowed quite a few tricks from in terms of the drum production side, what he does, he's got an awesome studio in Massachusetts, and what he does is he creates impulse responses of his own studio at different positions. So then he can actually sample replace or sample augment his own drums, and then run them through essentially what behave as the same acoustic space, which is really cool, really cool. I didn't have that luxury. I would have loved, because this was recorded in Cyprus, in one of our good friends' studios on a beautiful SSL console with a really nice live drum room. I need to ask him next time for the next songs to see if he can create some impulse responses of the studio for me. But I don't know if he'll do it, because then he might say, well, what do you need me for? You basically got my studio in a little file. So we'll see. Well, I'll have to ask him about that. So yeah, what I was saying is actually I used the dynamic EQ in a quite interesting way. So we can see here I've got toms, right? So this is my tom group. I've got tom 1, 2, 3, and 4, and they're all being routed into this tom group. I've got my kick bus here, and I have my snare bus here, and they all are routing a certain amount. It looks like the kicks are not, but a certain amount into what I've called the room sidechain. And this is the room sidechain. So it's taking all the signals. So if we solo the room sidechain, you won't hear anything, because it's being routed out to a gate in the room reverb. So here's our room reverb bus. And what I've done here is I've got an impulse response reverb. So let's solo this impulse response reverb, and you'll hear what it is, what it's doing. So you can hear it's got some kick in it. Actually, it's got no kick in it. Sorry, it's got snare and it's got toms in it, and it's actually got a bit of high end of the bass. So let's mute the bass for the purposes now. And I'm basically creating this room sound. That's then kind of supporting the drums. If I play the drums without that, and then bring it in, you'll hear the difference. So this is without. This is just the drums, and then I bring this in. Hopefully you'll hear the difference. So you can certainly hear it in the tail of the snare. It just adds a bit more body to the tail of the snare. And it's kind of these little tricks that are all kind of like what I've found is that as I've been mixing more and more, where I've ended up is doing lots and lots of quite subtle things to get to an end result. Rather than doing a few like really heavy-handed things. It always ends up being a few subtle things that add up together to create what you want. But I think like I don't know about you, but these drums sound freaking amazing to me. Right? Am I right? I think so. And you know, there's a lot of stuff going on. Maybe we can just do a quick rundown of some of the processing on the individual elements. Toms, pretty simple, high pass, different levels for each of the toms, and some generous EQing. Nothing super insane. And then I've got that going into a tom bus, which I'm using basically like a VCA compressor, so a very fast compressor. Let's see if we can find a nice tom fill. And I can show you what that's doing. Toms. Here we go. Let's just listen to the toms. So one of the things about the toms actually is that I was extremely aggressive in the editing of the toms. So actually, this is worth talking about because this is a really cool way to handle toms. It's a bit of work, but it allows you to get a balance between really natural, but also really clean and crisp. So you've got your tom track, right? Your tom track on its own. Let's listen to that on its own. I've actually got it doing very little. It's actually muted for most of the song. And I'll explain why that's the case. I duplicate this tom track, right? And then what I do is I duplicate it twice. So I've got what I call a tom 1 high and a tom 1 low. The tom 1 high is high passed, pretty high. In this case, 330 hertz. And then the tom 1 low is low passed, exactly the same frequency. This basically allows me to edit really in a quite aggressive way. So really from the high, if we listen to just the high, you'll hear that basically I'm cutting the tom off almost immediately after the transient. It just goes boom and that's it. Don't know if you can hear that, but it's just ding, that's it. With the low, because you're cutting off a lot of the high frequencies, what you're actually able to do is you're actually able to extend the tail of that audio longer than the high, because even with bleed, you're cutting out a lot of that stuff with the EQ. So you can hear it's a bit longer, doo-doo, and it holds a bit longer. It's not quite as short as the high. So together, those basically give you the crack and give you some of the body that follows, but without having to be quite relaxed in your editing. Because the problem that happens when you're super relaxed in your editing is you start to hear other stuff, other high-end stuff, like the crack of the snare or the hi-hat or the cymbals, for example. Then, if you have the luxury of having bottom mics as well, you can do exactly the same thing. And the bottom mics are great because you don't get a lot of that spill from other parts of the drum kit. They're underneath where most of the loud stuff's going on. And so you can really use that to enhance the body of the tom. So what you end up with is 3 separate tracks. Together, they create a nice tom sound. Why have I got this tom 1 here? So this tom 1 is basically the unedited tom track. It's got, I believe, I've actually put some high pass on it, but nothing, some low pass on it, sorry, but nothing as aggressive as the high-low split that I did at 330 Hertz. This is much more tame. Why do I want this? Well, sometimes in your editing process, what happens is you over-edit the toms and then they just end up sounding unnatural, right? Well, throw in a bit of the original track that's got some of that spillover, blend it in subtly, and then you've got a tom that sits really nicely. So you can see, in this case, I didn't feel that I needed it. Right here, I've got none of that original track coming through. It's all the edited drums. But here, for example, I probably felt that it didn't sound good. So if we listen without, it's super quiet, isn't it? Let's see if we can bring up tom 1. Try again. Automation, you bastard. Okay, so it cuts off quite quickly, and then if we put in the original, we'll end up with something that hangs over a bit more. Do you hear that? Doo-doo. That's the natural decay of the drum that I've brought in after, just to kind of keep it sounding natural. So that's toms. So I've done that with all the toms. One thing to note, have I used different high pass and low pass frequencies? No, I haven't. So for each of the drums, I've used 330 as the cutoff between high and low. What else? Some very interesting stuff happening. So the last thing I'll talk about on the drums is some pretty interesting routing. So what I've done is all the snare samples, I was finding that they were coming out and making the overall snare sound quite dry. By dry, I mean they didn't have a natural room feel when all the other drums are involved, right? So what I've done is I've sent each of these samples into an auxiliary track called snare sample verb, which is here. And that snare sample verb goes into the room verb bus. So that's adding a little bit of touch of extra reverb, the same thing that I did with the toms earlier. So in fact, when you listen to just room verb on its own, oh, no wonder the toms were so quiet. I was listening to them through the room verb rather than the tracks themselves. So when you listen to room verb on its own, and let's mute the toms, what you're hearing is actually only the snare samples going through this reverb, none of the original snare, because with the original snare, I don't need any extra reverb. I'm using overheads and room mics to get that sound, right? Let's actually get to some snares. So this is, we've got We've got guitars as well. Got guitar going on. Where are all the guitars? There we go. So that's all snare sample into the room reverb. Apart from that little Rhodes that you'll hear more about later. So yeah, that's that. That's cool. I like that trick a lot. I use it. So you can see basically what I've done is I've used samples but blended them in a way. Can you not route the toms in the other bus? Yeah, so that's what I've oh, can I not route the toms into snare sample verb? Yes, but I didn't need to. The reason I did it with the snares, with the snare samples, is that I wanted to route a different amount. So, for example, maybe I changed this. Yeah, so I changed this, but at some point I had different amounts of each sample going into that auxiliary, so that the balance that I was getting in the room verb bus was actually a little bit different to the balance of the dry samples. With the toms, I'm basically I've thrown the whole bus into there if and when I need it. So if I want a particular fill to be a bit more roomy, then I've just gone and automated that and put it straight into the room reverb bus. Obviously, one of the things that ends up happening here is, like, you know, mixing is an iterative process. So sometimes you'll do one thing one way and then you'll find a quicker way of doing it later, and your project just ends up a bit of a hodgepodge. What I did yesterday is I spent a good 2-3 hours cleaning up this project. So this is the clean version of the project, just for the purposes of this stream. But yeah, another thing I should mention, and the biggest pain in the ass for the whole project really, is aligning samples to the original tracks. So with each of the snares and each of the kick samples, I went through hit by hit and phase aligned each of them to the original drum hits. It is a fucking headache. It is awful. I hate it. It's the worst part of this process. And if I could not do it, I would happily not do it. But yeah, I just like the outcome and the output so much that I end up doing it. So my fault. No one to blame but myself. Let's talk about bass guitar. I think we're done with drums. Unless you got any questions on the drums, we can talk about bass. Let's mute some drums and let's hear some bass. Okay, I think we've got some bass. Solo, right. Lovely. Okay, so how did I record the bass? Do I apply distortion on the drums? That's actually a good question. I didn't talk about drum bus processing. What do I have on here? I've got some EQ, a very subtle low and high end boost. And then a good amount of compression. I'm using a 70, so it's an 1176 compression model. So that will naturally bring in a little distortion. I don't believe I have any other aspects of the drums that are distorted, other than I did mention that some of the room verb bus gets a little distortion as well. Yeah, it might be worth just hearing the drums with and without the track compression, because I do believe that makes a difference. So this is, let's see if we can bypass it from within the plugin. Well, let's actually bring it in. So let's go 100% dry to start. So what I'm actually doing is just bringing it in 40%, so it's kind of like a parallel compression basically. So that's 0, and that's 100. That fucking sounds good, but it also sounds good because it's a lot louder. And that's kind of where I settled on. So you can see it's doing, how much gain reduction is it doing? I'm not sure it's doing much actually. It might actually only be in the toms that it's actually doing any serious gain. Yeah, so you can see it's doing like maybe 1 dB gain reduction, and then the rest is just color from the model. And you get quite a bit of color from this Q bias as well. I can't remember exactly what it does. Brings quite a bit of brightness. Where was it? 195, I think. Yeah. Yeah, it is a gentle compression, but I've done compression directly on the snare. I've done compression directly on the toms, individually, and on the bus. So at that point, I'm not too bothered about doing a huge amount of compression on the drums. I guess the goal is, like I said, to keep everything really, really natural.
Chris, can you still hear me?
Yeah, man, we can hear you.
When you're at the mixing stage,
Yeah,
how do you go about figuring out like how loud you want the snare to be relative to the kick, relative to the hi-hat? Like, do you follow some kind of general like a sort of standard framework or guidelines, or do you literally just adjust faders up and down until it kind of sounds good to you in the context of the song?
mostly by ear, but I do have a general rule, which is the peaks of the kick and the snare almost the same. The kick may be a little bit lower than the peak of the snare. So say the snare is peaking at like -6 dB, then in the kick's peaking at -8 dB. That's good for me. Like I'll run with that. I don't know to what extent I held true in that regard with this track, but we can probably check it out and see where they're peaking. So we've got the snare bus here, we've got the kick bus here. Oh, we're way out in the weeds. So we've got kicks peaking at -16, and we've got snares peaking at like -10. Yeah. So there's about 6 dB difference there. In the outro, it might be a little bit different actually. Yeah, so about 6 dB difference, but it depends. It just depends on the song. You might want a song where the kick's just slaying, right? And then in that case, you'll bring it up to almost like parity with the snare. In terms of hi-hat, it's just balance. Like, what do you want to hear? What do you want to hear in this section? Like, I think that I do. There's a little bit of volume automation on the hi-hat. So this section I bring it up quite a bit, so I'm just wondering what this section is. Right, so in this section you're doing the odd hit. You're doing the odd hit, and it brings it up really nicely. Yeah. So I really wanted to bring up those accents. So there's a whole shit ton of that going on in this track that I'm just like, I look at the, because this was obviously like a year or so ago, and I look into the automation. I'm going, what was I thinking when I did that change? But for the most part, it's there's a good reason behind it.